Welcome back to another episode review of Eerie, Indiana. If you're new here, I've been doing a review of every single episode of Eerie, Indiana, so feel free to watch my previous videos. In this video, I'll be reviewing episode 12, Marshall's Theory of Believability. So let's get into it. This episode originally aired on February 2nd, 1992, and was directed again by Bob Balaban. This episode starts off with Marshall and Simon and Marshall's dad, Edgar, waiting in line to see Professor Nigel Zircon's traveling museum of the parabelievable. Just then, the mayor walks past them, cutting them in line with his entourage. Marshall gets mad, but Edgar tells Marshall to show some respect, and the mayor walks in. Simon then says he was born for this and gives the ticket to the usher, who was played by the late Michael J. Pollard, known for House of a Thousand Corpses, Dick Tracy, and Scrooged. Sadly, he passed away in 2019. They walk in the museum, and Marshall tells us that Professor Zircon was a scientist, explorer, and the world's foremost expert on weirdness, something Marshall and Simon can relate to. They come across El Gordo and are amazed.
Discovered in 1932, El Gordo ate enough food each day to feed all the first graders in Normal, Illinois for 1 week. Unbelievable!
I'll say.
Marshall then says he loves science, but Edgar is fast to tell him it isn't exactly science. The mayor is then seen telling us that the professor has drawn a huge commotion in Eerie without a permit. Marshall and Simon are admiring a couple of UFO pictures Professor Zircon has captured. Simon asks how he gets them so clear. Marshall then tells him that's why he's the best. Then, Professor Zircon from the background tells them that it's nice to see young people appreciate good evidence, and introduces himself, but they already know who he is. Professor Zircon was played by Sir John Standing, and he's done a ton of film work. Marshall introduces himself and Simon to the professor, and Simon fangirls out and asks Professor for his autograph. Just then, the mayor pops in, and tells the professor he'd like a word with him, but the professor tells him he can't because he has to make a presentation. It cuts to the usher introducing Professor Zircon to the audience, and Marshall and Simon are of course excited. Professor Zircon begins to tell them that he has discovered an object that is about to enter the Earth's orbit, and that it's not American or Russian in origin.
Therefore, this leaves only one possibility.
Extraterrestrial!
Exactly!
Edgar isn't really believing the professor. Professor Zircon then tells the audience that he believes that within the next 24 hours, this object will land right in Eerie, Indiana. This leaves Marshall thinking he can finally believe someone, or better yet, someone who will finally believe him. That night, Marshall and Simon are looking out the window for that UFO object. They are trying to get good evidence for the professor so they can impress him. They suggest showing him their Bigfoot print because Professor Zircon has written 2 books on the subject. They think that the professor can help them blow the lid off Eerie. They pack the print in a big box, and they think that someone like Professor Zircon probably won't even see them, but they have to try. He was their only hope to prove that Eerie was not normal. They lug the heavy box, and Simon drops his end on accident. Simon says he's nervous, but Marshall tells him to act professional. Then we see Professor Zircon and the usher again, only this time they are looking at some plans or prints of something. The usher says it's his best work yet, and Professor Zircon says he'll have people waiting in long lines just to see this, and they both start laughing. Just then, Marshall and Simon appear and ask Professor Zircon if they can talk to him.
Beat it, and don't screw up again.
It cuts to all 3 of them sitting down, and Marshall thinking how great it was that he was actually talking to Professor Zircon, who tracked the abominable snowman of Tibet and pickled El Gordo. Marshall explains to the professor how Eerie is the center of weirdness for the entire planet. The professor then tells him that he's going to need proof, and more proof. Marshall was hoping he'd say that. They are about to show him the Bigfoot print, but it turns out to be some dirt clods. Just then, they hear some police sirens. It's the mayor and his entourage outside. The mayor informs the professor that his museum is on public property, and he has Officer Knight read him some citations.
Violation 42A-77, leaky oil pan. Violation of Civic Code PDQ-69, Unsightly display of satellite antenna in business district. Violation of traffic code.
The mayor tells them that they don't like outsiders there, especially with people making predictions about UFOs without a permit.
Let me tell you something about Eerie, Mr. Professor. You know, people from these parts like to breathe through their mouth.
And the mayor tells him to get his museum out of there.
We'll track you down and write you up.
Marshall apologizes to Professor Zircon, but Zircon says he's used to it, and that he needs to be going. Marshall then has an idea and tells Zircon where he can park his museum, in Marshall's driveway. We see in the museum parked outside his driveway, and his mom is telling Professor Zircon how he is a hero to Marshall. Zircon tells her that he's just a businessman and scientist. Marshall's mom then tells Professor Zircon that he's gonna love meeting Edgar when he gets home because Edgar is a scientist too, which makes Professor Zircon uneasy. Just then, Edgar arrives home.
Rolling museum of the ridiculous doing in my driveway.
Professor Zircon. Hi. Hello.
I'm gonna meet outside.
It cuts to the usher walking through the woods when he hears some rustling noises. It cuts back to Marshall and Simon eating dinner outside, looking for the UFO. Marshall tells Simon to eat and he'll cover for him. Simon thanks Marshall's mom, and Marshall asks her how his dad and Professor Zircon are getting along. She replies with fine, just fine, and goes back inside, where Professor Zircon and Edgar seem tense. Marshall's mom tells Professor Zircon that Edgar is working on a new speed food processor. Edgar says it's nothing as exciting as Professor Zircon's work, but Zircon tells Edgar he has the most respect for Edgar's work. Cindy then asks the professor how he's going to track this orbital particle, which makes Edgar snap.
There's not going to be any unidentified space debris landing in Eerie. And I'm sorry, there's nothing wonderful about the boys wasting the evening in the front yard. I mean, why don't we just send them out there on Christmas to get Polaroids of Santa's reindeer? I happen to know a little something about orbital mechanics and...
Edgar, please.
No, dear, I have to make my stand. For your information, Professor Zircon, I interned at the Smithsonian Institute before entering Syracuse.
It cuts to the usher placing some sort of fake UFO object on the ground. He keeps hearing noises. He calls for whoever is out there, but gets no response. He then fires a flare into the air, and Marshall and Simon notice it. It cuts back to the usher, who keeps hearing noises, and shines his flashlight at something. It turns out to be a female Bigfoot. Back at the tellers, Edgar is still going on his rant, but then Marshall and Simon barge in telling them that the space object is here, which then gives Professor Zircon a moment of, "I told you so?" Marshall and Simon lead them to the direction of the object, but Professor Zircon says according to his research, it should be over there, but Marshall and Simon insist it's coming from their direction. They find the space object, and Professor Zircon says it's even more impressive than he imagined, but to Marshall's family, this was big time weird. The next day, Professor Zircon has the object on display and is having a press release for the whole town. Marshall said that everyone was getting their 15 seconds of fame.
It's too early to say, of course, but this may change the way we look at the past, present, and future.
This is only scratching the surface. You wouldn't believe some of the things that go on around here. For instance,
You might say that we here in Eerie feel that we each own a piece of this incredible thing. The genuine item does say I have been to Eerie and seen the space thing.
At the World of Stuff, the mayor and his entourage are trying to make an offer to Professor Zircon for the space object. Professor Zircon refuses their first offer, but the mayor and his entourage decide on another offer for it, which seems to be Professor Zircon's plan all along.
When's lunch?
Marshall and Edgar were listening in, and they step outside. Marshall senses his dad is upset and asks him what's wrong. Edgar responds and tells him he's in a tough spot. Marshall tells him he knows that he doesn't like Professor Zircon, but Edgar says it's not that. He just doesn't want Marshall to be disappointed, like the time he found out that Santa Claus wasn't real and how he waited all night for him with a Polaroid just to prove Edgar wrong. But Marshall tells him he did show up, but his camera was broken.
I saw the space thing fall from the sky. I saw it and found it. Just because it didn't happen in your laboratory doesn't mean it's not real.
Marshall, the man is a con artist. Everything, and I mean everything in that museum is a hoax. I mean, even his name is phony.
You're wrong. You're wrong, and I'm gonna prove it.
Edgar then feels down on himself for that little outburst.
Well done, Edgar. Well done.
Later on, Marshall and Simon sneak into the museum. Marshall didn't know exactly what he was looking for either, but he had to prove something to his dad, and to himself. Just then, Marshall leans on a wall, revealing a secret room. They discover pie tins and other objects used to make UFOs and Bigfoot prints. He realizes his dad was right. They open a file cabinet with a folder with fake IDs. The more they looked, the less they saw Professor Zircon. Then they find the folder of Operation Space Object. It cuts to Professor Zircon waiting for the final offer from the mayor, which is $1 million for the sole ownership of the object, and Professor Zircon accepts the offer. Just then, Marshall and Simon crash the meeting to expose the professor.
Hey, we're doing business here.
They show the mayor the file and say everything is fake.
Operation Space Object will work best if we find a small, isolated town with an ineffective government and an overbearing, money-grabbing mayor.
It cuts to Marshall and Simon sitting outside. Edgar asks Marshall how he feels, and Marshall tells him crummy. Marshall tells his dad that this is worse than the Santa Claus thing because he never wanted to be like Santa. He wanted to be more like Professor Zircon. Edgar then lays some knowledge on Marshall.
Marshall, sometimes in life, it's gonna seem like there's nothing worth believing in. But I want you to know there's one thing you can always count on. One thing that's never gonna change. That's the fact that your mother and I love you. No matter what.
Mr. Radford asked Marshall if he'd like the UFO object because he was just going to throw it away. Marshall agrees to keep it. Later on that night, Simon suggests they still put it in the evidence locker, even though it's fake. Then Nigel Zircon approaches them and tells Marshall he's a good kid and he deserves an explanation. He tells him he was going for one big score so he can retire. He's tired of being Professor Zircon. Marshall tells him that people look up to him, that they think all his stuff is true. Professor Zircon tells him that people will believe whatever they want to believe, and that there's no such thing as UFOs and Bigfoot. But then the usher says there most certainly is. Professor Zircon apologizes for the usher, who he reveals his name to be Claude.
Hi. What's that thing?
It's your phony space junk.
That's not the space dealie I planted. Mine was much more realistic. Heck, that thing doesn't even blink.
Then Simon and Marshall ask what it is then, and where did it come from. Just then the space object begins to light up and float away, and Simon manages to take some pics of it as it goes up into space. Later on in the attic, Simon says his pics look like every other UFO pic out there, but Marshall says at least it's proof. It represented something very important for Marshall and Simon though. It allowed them to believe in the unbelievable again. And that concludes episode 12, another great episode. This episode kind of went into a different direction than usual. More of a debunking episode, but it was still enjoyable. They brought the weirdness back at the end, which I thought was a great ending to conclude the episode. The acting again was great, and more character development for Edgar. Let me know if you remember this episode, and I thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.